Most people come to a place like this to celebrate. I come to observe. The restaurant, one of those hushed temples of modern American cuisine in Boston's Back Bay, was an ecosystem built on performance. The low, intimate lighting, the muted clink of heavy silverware against porcelain, the almost reverent way the sommelier presented the wine. It was all a carefully constructed stage, and tonight I had a front row seat to the most important performance of my daughter's life. My daughter, Emily, the only first edition that ever truly mattered. Across the table, she was radiant. Her smile wasn't the polite, practiced curve you saw on the other patrons. It was genuine, a light that could make even a cynic like me believe in something. And the source of that light, sitting beside her, was Julian. To the untrained eye, Julian was flawless. The suit was Brioni, or a very good imitation. The watch, an Audemars Piguet, was substantial, catching the light in a way that was meant to be noticed but not stared at. He spoke with the easy confidence of a man who'd never been told no in his life. He was handsome, charismatic, and the founder of some fintech startup that was, in his words, poised to disrupt the entire transactional space. He spoke in headlines, not in sentences. Disruption, synergy, scaling, leverage, words designed to sound impressive while saying nothing at all. I'd spent 30 years in a business that depended on separating substance from noise, and Julian was a symphony of noise. The Series B funding round was a massive success, Art, he was saying, leaning forward with conspiratorial enthusiasm. He called me Art, not Arthur, not Mr. Henderson. Art, a casual, breezy familiarity meant to disarm, to imply we were peers. It had the opposite effect. We're talking a valuation that's, well, it's astronomical. I nodded slowly, taking a sip of the Cabernet he'd ordered. It was a good bottle. Expensive. He knew what to order, but he didn't know how to drink it. He held the glass by the bowl, warming the wine. A small thing, a meaningless detail to most. To me, it was a tell. It was the equivalent of a book collector boasting about a rare volume while leaving it in direct sunlight. It spoke of ownership without appreciation, of possessing the signifiers of wealth without understanding their meaning. My old trade wasn't about books. It was about reading people. I read them the way I now read a 17th century folio, checking the binding, the watermarks, the faintest scent of forgery. And Julian, for all his polish, smelled faintly of cheap glue. I saw it in the micro-expressions. The flicker of impatience in his eyes when Emily spoke about her work at the art gallery, a job she loved, but which he clearly saw as a quaint hobby. The way his smile, so wide and brilliant when directed at her, never quite reached his eyes. It was a performer smile, switched on and off like a stage light. His hands were manicured soft. They looked like they'd never held a tool, fixed a leak, or done anything that couldn't be outsourced. My hands, by contrast, are a map of my life. Paper cuts from 1,000 pages, calluses from stretching vellum, a faint chemical scent of binding adhesive that never quite washes away. I build things. I restore things. I take what is broken and make it whole again. I looked at Julian and saw a man who only knew how to take. "That's wonderful news, Julian," I said, my voice even in calm. It's a tone my employees at the bookstore know well. It's the voice I use just before I point out a fatal flaw in a business proposal. Emily must be very proud. "She's my rock," he said, squeezing her hand. He looked at her, and for a moment, the performance was perfect. He looked at her like she was the single most valuable asset in his portfolio. And maybe she was. Emily blushed, her happiness so pure it was painful to watch. She saw a protector, a brilliant partner, a future. I saw a predator who had found the perfect mark, a beautiful, intelligent woman with a trusting heart, and he likely assumed, a doting father with a quiet fortune tucked away. He wouldn't know that my real fortune wasn't in stocks or real estate, but in ledgers of a very different kind. Favors owed, secrets kept, and networks that lay dormant but never disappeared. "So," Julian continued, shifting his attention back to me, "the real target. Emily tells me you're in the book business. Must be quiet." The faint condescension was masterfully done. Just a hint. Enough to establish his superiority without being overtly rude. It has its moments, I replied, allowing a small, placid smile. Old books are a lot like old secrets. They hold their value, and the stories they tell are often more interesting than the ones on the surface. His eyes glazed over for a fraction of a second. The metaphor was lost on him. He dealt in futures, in projections, in things that didn't exist yet. I dealt in the past, in provenance, in the unchangeable record of what was. The dinner continued. He talked about his penthouse in the Seaport District, the new Tesla he was having delivered, a planned trip to St. Bart's. He was painting a picture of a life so dazzling it was meant to blind. Emily was captivated, and I, the quiet, tweed-wearing bookseller from Beacon Hill, just watched. I cataloged every word, every gesture, every subtle lie of omission. It was a professional habit, one I thought I had retired. As we stood to leave, he clapped me on the shoulder. "Great getting to know you better, Art." The gesture was too firm, a pantomime of male bonding. "You too, Julian," I said, looking him directly in the eye. In my world, that's when you see the truth. Most people flinch. They look away. Julian held my gaze, his eyes as shiny and empty as polished stone. There was nothing behind them. No lips, no soul, just a cold, calculating ambition. Walking home through the quiet, gaslit streets of my neighborhood, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Boston air. I had spent a lifetime protecting valuable things from predators. First editions, historical documents, corporate assets, people. Now, the most valuable thing in my life was walking willingly into the lion's den. My instinct, the one honed by decades of risk assessment, was screaming at me to act, to dig, to expose, to dismantle him piece by piece before he could do any damage. But then I thought of Emily's face, so full of love and hope. She was an adult. This was her choice. To interfere would be to break her trust, perhaps forever. A father's role, I told myself, is to advise, not to control. So I decided to do the hardest thing I'd ever done. I decided to do nothing. I would be the quiet bookseller. I would trust my daughter. For her, I was willing to be wrong. I was praying to be wrong. But in my line of work, you learn a hard lesson. Your first instinct is almost never wrong. And my gut was telling me that I hadn't just met my daughter's fiancé. I had just met an enemy. I just didn't know then that the war had already been declared. The next few months were a masterclass in modern courtship, conducted mostly over FaceTime and Instagram. Julian was a whirlwind of grand gestures. A surprise weekend trip to Paris for Emily. A vintage Cartier necklace just because. Photos of them at charity galas, clinking champagne glasses with the city's elite. He was curating their life, not living it, and each post was a carefully chosen piece of evidence for the case he was building. The case of Julian and Emily, the perfect power couple. Emily was deliriously happy. She'd call me, her voice bubbling with excitement, to recount their latest adventure. I listened, offered the requisite fatherly enthusiasm, and filed away the details. Paris? I made a quiet call to a contact at the American Express Centurion office. The trip was paid for with a card that was perilously close to its limit. The gala? A colleague on the museum board mentioned that Julian had bought the cheapest tickets available, but spent the evening networking as if he'd sponsored the entire event. Red flags. Little ones, but they were multiplying. Still, I held back. This was my daughter's happiness, and it was a fragile, beautiful thing. To touch it with my suspicions felt like an act of vandalism. We spoke about the wedding in vague terms. "Sometime next year," Emily would say. "Julian wants it to be perfect, Dad. You know how he is." Oh, I knew. Perfection is the best place to hide flaws. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. It was a crisp October day. The scent of old paper and decaying leaves filled my shop. I was in the back, meticulously repairing the spine of a first edition Hemingway. A delicate, almost meditative process. My phone buzzed on the workbench. It was Emily's number, but her face didn't pop up. Just the number. Strange. I wiped my hands and answered. "Emily, sweetheart." "Hey, Art. It's Julian." His voice was different. The slick, polished charm was gone, replaced by a lazy, almost bored tone. The voice of a man who no longer feels the need to perform. "Julian, everything all right?" I asked, my own voice remaining placid. My heart rate, however, had just ticked up by 5 beats per minute. Yeah, everything's great. Hey, Emily's just in the shower. I'm just going through some of our mail here. A pause. I could hear him shuffling papers. Listen, we were just talking about you the other day. Oh, I kept my response neutral. This was not a social call. This was something else. Yeah, Emily was saying we haven't really locked down a wedding date yet, and that you were probably getting anxious to know. A wave of relief washed over me, immediately followed by suspicion. Why was he the one telling me this? Well, of course, I'm excited for you both, I said carefully. Just let me know when you have a date in mind. Your mother would have wanted me to help plan. He cut me off with a short, dry chuckle. It was a genuinely unpleasant sound. And then he said them. The 11 words that shattered the fragile peace. The 11 words that took my quiet, retired life and set it on fire. Oh, we got married last week, Art, he said, his tone dripping with casual condescension. Decided it should just be for the important people. Silence. The world didn't stop. A car horn blared on Charles Street. A customer's bell tinkled at the front of the shop. The old clock on my wall continued its steady, relentless tick-tock. But in my head, a switch flipped. A heavy, iron switch that hadn't been thrown in a very long time. The air in my lungs turned to ice. Just for the important people. He hadn't just excluded me. He had judged me. He had weighed my worth in his glittering, hollow world and found me wanting. Me, the man who raised the woman he now wore on his arm like a trophy. The grandfather of his future children. He had erased me from one of the most significant days of her life and then announced it to me with the same casual indifference he might use to mention he'd picked up dry cleaning. In that single, crystalline moment of silence, I felt 30 years of carefully constructed calm fall away. The mild-mannered bookseller evaporated. The man who stood in his place was someone else entirely. Someone colder, sharper, and infinitely more dangerous. I see, I finally said. My voice was unervingly steady. It was the voice I used when a negotiation had irrevocably broken down, and the only thing left was to calculate the cost of demolition. Yeah, he continued, oblivious. He thought he was talking to a dusty old man. He had no idea he was standing on a trapdoor. He'd just armed himself. It was just a quick thing at City Hall. A few of my investors were there, our closest friends. You know how it is. We're going to do a big party next year. You'll come to that. It wasn't an invitation. It was a dismissal. You can come to the party for the less important people. I didn't rage. I didn't yell. Rage is a hot, messy emotion. What I felt was cold. It was the crystalline purity of purpose. He had mistaken my quiet life for weakness, my love for my daughter for leverage. He had fundamentally misread the man on the other end of this line. And in my world, a misread of that magnitude is not a mistake. It is a fatal error. Well, I said, my voice smooth as silk. Congratulations, Julian. I hope you'll both be very happy. Thanks, Art. Knew you'd understand. Gotta run. Emily's out of the shower. Talk soon. He hung up. I stood there, the receiver still pressed to my ear, listening to the dead air. I placed it gently back in its cradle. I looked down at my hands. They were perfectly still. I picked up the fine-tip bone folder from my workbench. With surgical precision, I made a final, perfect crease in the leather of the Hemingway spine. The job was done. The restoration was complete. And now a new project had just begun. The deconstruction of Julian Vance. He had sealed his fate with 11 words. He didn't know it yet. He thought he had married into a comfortable, quiet life. He had no idea he had just made an enemy of a man who specialized in making important people disappear. For 2 days, I did nothing. Or rather, it appeared as if I did nothing. I opened the shop at 10, as always. I sold a lovely set of Trollop to a tourist from Ohio. I drank my afternoon tea, Earl Grey, 2 sugars, and read the Globe. To any outside observer, I was the same Arthur Henderson, a man whose life moved at the gentle pace of turning pages. Inside, however, the gears were turning with a cold, relentless precision. The initial shock had solidified into a diamond-hard resolve. This wasn't just about a personal slight. Julian hadn't just insulted me. He had isolated my daughter. A quick, quiet wedding with investors instead of her father? That wasn't an oversight. It was a strategic move. The first step in cutting her off from her old life, from her only remaining family, making her completely dependent on him. He was building a cage around her, and he just locked the door. My job was not to rage. My job was to find the key, or, failing that, to dismantle the cage bar by bar. On the third day, the phone rang again. I knew it would. Predators, especially the arrogant ones, always return to the scene of the kill to admire their work. It was Emily. Her voice was bright, but brittle. I could hear the forced cheerfulness, the carefully rehearsed speech she was about to deliver. Dad, hi. I am so sorry you had to hear from Julian. It was all such a whirlwind, and we were going to call you right after, I swear, but things got so crazy. It's all right, sweetheart, I said, my voice warm and paternal. The role of the slightly hurt but understanding father. It was a necessary fiction. It's your life. As long as you're happy, that's all that matters to me. Oh, I am, Dad. I really am, she said, and the relief in her voice was palpable. He had probably coached her, warned her I'd be angry, and positioned himself as the one who would protect her from my old-fashioned disapproval. Checkmate, you son of a bitch. But listen, she continued, her tone shifting slightly. The real reason for the call was coming. Julian needs to talk to you for a second about the gift. I'll put him on. She didn't wait for a response. There was a brief fumbling, and then his voice was on the line. The lazy arrogance was back, but this time it was edged with impatience. Art, you there? I'm here, Julian. Good. Look, I'm looking at an invoice here from the Realty Group for the penthouse. The first and last month's rent is overdue. The broker has been calling me all morning. I thought you were handling this. There it was. The transactional heart of the matter. Before their engagement, during a dinner that now felt like a scene from a different lifetime, I had made a generous offer. As a wedding gift, I would pay the lease on a nice apartment for them for 1 year. A way to help them start their new life without financial pressure. I'd pictured them in a lovely brownstone in the South End. Julian, of course, had chosen a glass-walled monstrosity in the seaport with a view of the harbor and a monthly rent that could fund a small library. I remember our conversation. I said calmly, "Yeah, well, the money hasn't been transferred," he said, the annoyance clear in his voice. "I gave you the account details last month. Can you get on that today? It's making me look bad." The sheer, unmitigated gall of it was almost breathtaking. He had deemed me unworthy of attending his wedding, but fully expected my wallet to be present and accounted for. He hadn't married my daughter. He had acquired her, and he was now presenting me with the bill for his acquisition. I let the silence hang in the air for a few seconds. Let him grow uncomfortable. Let him wonder what the old man was thinking. Then I replied. My voice was quiet, almost conversational. I didn't raise it. I didn't need to. The coldest threats are always delivered in a whisper. "Julian," I said, "weren't you the one who told me that the wedding was only for important people?" Another beat of silence. This one was different. It was heavier. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head as he processed the words, as the implication finally dawned on him. He had expected a quiet, compliant checkbook. He had not expected the checkbook to talk back. "What's that supposed to mean?" he finally snapped, all pretense of civility gone. "It's a simple question," I continued, my tone as gentle as if I were discussing the weather. My gift was a wedding gift. It was intended for the man who was marrying my daughter, a man who would by definition be family, an important person in my life. But you made it quite clear what my status is in your new life. So I have to ask. I paused, letting the final words land with the weight of a closing vault door. Why would I pay for the rent of someone to whom I am not important? I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. He was stunned. He was a man who moved through the world on a cloud of charm and intimidation, a world where people gave him what he wanted. He had no protocol for this, no script for being denied. "Are you serious?" he sputtered, his voice rising in disbelief. "This is about your feelings? You're going to screw over your own daughter because your feelings are hurt." "No, Julian," I said, and now the ice in my voice was unmistakable. "This isn't about my feelings. This is about your choices. You made a choice when you excluded me. You defined our relationship. I am simply honoring the terms you've set." "You old..." He started, but I cut him off. This conversation is over. And I hung up the phone. I stood in the quiet of my workshop, the scent of leather and dust, a comforting familiarity. The war was no longer cold. The first shot had been fired, not by him with his cruel words, but by me with the simple surgical act of closing my wallet. He thought this was about money. He thought he could bully and manipulate his way to getting what he wanted. He was about to learn that I don't play games with money. I play games with information. And the rent on his shiny penthouse was about to become the very least of his problems. Because I wasn't just cutting him off. I was going to start digging. And I had a very strong feeling that Julian's perfect, disruptive life was built on a foundation of sand, and a storm was coming. The basement of my shop is not for customers. It's not a place for dusty, forgotten inventory. It's my sanctum. The walls are lined not with bookshelves, but with fireproof filing cabinets and climate-controlled shelving for my private collection, the truly rare items that never see the light of day. The air is cool and still, smelling of aged paper and ozone from the humming electronics. To most, it would look like the archive of a reclusive, slightly paranoid collector. And in a way, it is. I descended the creaking wooden stairs, the single bare bulb overhead casting long shadows. I walked past a locked cabinet containing a signed first edition of Moby Dick and stopped before a plain, gray steel locker. The lock wasn't a key or a combination. It was a biometric scanner, a relic from my former life that had cost more than my first car. I pressed my thumb against the cool glass plate. There was a soft whir, a heavy click, and the door swung open. Inside was not a book, but a machine. A hardened, military-grade laptop encased in a black Pelican case, surrounded by what looked like outdated satellite phone equipment. It hadn't been powered on in nearly a decade. For years, it had been my Excalibur, a tool I used to dissect companies, ruin careers, and shift fortunes from the shadows. Opening it now felt like uncorking a bottle of very old, very dangerous whiskey. I set it up on a heavy oak table, the same one where I'd once pieced together the evidence of an insider trading ring that brought down a hedge fund manager. The machine booted up slowly, its fans whirring to life like an old man clearing his throat. The screen flickered, then settled on a simple, text-based operating system. No icons, no friendly interface. Just a black screen and a blinking cursor. A blank page, waiting for a story. I didn't start with Google. Google is for amateurs. It gives you the curated, public-facing narrative that people like Julian so carefully construct. I needed the footnotes, the drafts, the pages that had been torn out. I needed to open my old address book. The contacts were not stored on the machine. They were stored in my head, a string of encrypted email addresses and dead drops I had never allowed myself to forget. The first message was to a man I'll call the archivist. His real name is Marcus, and he used to be a senior enforcement analyst at the SEC. A brilliant bloodhound, a man who could see the ghost of fraud in a balance sheet. I helped his daughter get into a veterinary program she'd been unfairly rejected from. A small favor. He owed me a big one. My message was short, sent through a series of relays that bounced it across 3 continents before it would land at his inbox. Subject, provenance check. Body, Julian Vance. CEO, FinTech Innovations. Need full financial workup. Balance sheets, investor lists, debt covenants. The unvarnished version. Urgent. H. The second message went to a woman named Isabella. She's a freelance journalist, the kind who writes the devastating, deep-dive articles for the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times that get CEOs fired. Her specialty is human intelligence. She can get a disgruntled CFO or a jilted mistress to talk when no one else can. I once provided her with the information that broke the story of a major pharmaceutical company faking its clinical trial data. The story won her a Pulitzer. She owed me more than a favor. She owed me a career. Subject, character study. Body, Julian Vance. Public persona versus private reality. Associates, habits, vices. Particularly interested in his relationships, personal and professional. Discretion is paramount. H. The final message was different. It went to a man known only as Odysseus. He's a private investigator, but that's like calling a Navy SEAL a swimmer. He's ex-Mossad, a ghost who specializes in physical surveillance and asset tracking. He finds people and things that don't want to be found. I saved his life once in a very messy situation in Zurich involving some stolen bearer bonds and a handful of very unhappy Russians. He operates on a simple principle. Life debts are paid in full. Subject: a follow. Body: Julian Vance. Details attached. I need a pattern of life. Where he goes, who he meets. Everything. Especially the things he does when he thinks no one is watching. Age. I hit send on the last message, and the blinking cursor on the black screen stopped. The requests were out, floating in the digital ether. I had just activated a network of 3 of the most capable and discreet professionals on the East Coast. The total cost for their services, if billed to a normal client, would run into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. For me, the cost was 3 emails. My real business had never been about money. It had been about leverage. I closed the laptop and locked it back in its steel cabinet. The quiet of the basement settled around me again. I had cast the nets. Now all I had to do was wait for the fish to swim into them. Upstairs, the bell over the door tinkled. It was my afternoon regular, Mrs. Gable, coming to pick up her reserved copy of the latest Louise Penny mystery. "Arthur, you look like you've seen a ghost," she said, her kind, wrinkled face etched with concern. I summoned the gentle, scholarly smile she was used to. "Just wrestling with a particularly stubborn bit of history downstairs, Eleanor," I said. "Nothing a cup of tea won't fix." She smiled back, satisfied. But she was right. I had seen a ghost. The ghost of the man I used to be. And he was very, very busy. Julian Vance thought he was playing a simple game of intimidation with a retired old man. He had no idea he had just become the sole subject of a multi-pronged, top-tier intelligence operation. He was a character in a book he didn't even know was being written, and I was about to write his final chapter. The information didn't come in a flood. It came in trickles, then streams like a dam beginning to crack. My life returned to its placid rhythm, but my nights were spent in the basement, piecing together the mosaic of Julian Vance's life. Each encrypted email that arrived was another tile, and the picture that emerged was uglier than I could have imagined. The first crack came from Marcus, the archivist at the SEC. His email was dry, filled with financial jargon, but to me, it read like a horror story. FinTech Innovations wasn't poised to disrupt anything. It was a house of cards in a hurricane. The company had no proprietary technology. Their revolutionary algorithm was a poorly coded imitation of existing open-source software. Their revenue streams were virtually non-existent. The astronomical valuation Julian had bragged about was based on a single, highly questionable seed investment. And this was the masterstroke. Marcus had traced the source of that seed money. It wasn't a venture capital firm from Silicon Valley. It was a holding company based in the Cayman Islands, and that holding company was a known front for a syndicate run by a family out of Brighton Beach. These were not patient investors. They were loan sharks in bespoke suits. They didn't care about disruption or synergy. They cared about seeing their money back with a profit margin that would make a bank blush. Julian hadn't secured an investment. He had made a deal with the devil, and the devil's payment was coming due. He was bleeding money. The penthouse, the Tesla, the parties. It was all a frantic performance designed to lure in legitimate investors before the Brighton Beach crew lost their patience. He was running out of time, and he was desperate. The second crack came from Isabella, the journalist. Her report was more narrative, a collection of conversations and whispers from the world Julian inhabited. She was a master at getting people to talk. The portrait she painted was of a man consumed by envy. He came from a middle-class family in New Jersey, and he'd spent his entire life with his nose pressed against the glass of the world he wanted to inhabit. He was a social chameleon, brilliant at mimicking the manners and speech of the wealthy, but he was plagued by a deep-seated insecurity. His ex-girlfriends told similar stories. Charming and generous at first, then controlling, possessive, and pathologically obsessed with appearances. One of them mentioned his collection of replica watches. He called them placeholders, she told Isabella, for the real ones he knew he deserved. That Audemars Piguet on his wrist at dinner? Isabella had a source at a high-end pawn shop confirm it was a super clone, a near-perfect fake. The Brioni suit was real, but it was from a consignment shop. His entire life was a placeholder, a convincing facsimile of success. And then Isabella dropped the bombshell. She'd spoken to a disgruntled former assistant at his company. Apparently, Julian had a regular investor meeting every Wednesday afternoon at the Mandarin Oriental Hotel. But the investor was always the same person, the wife of his primary backer from Brighton Beach, a beautiful, bored woman named Anya. Their meetings were long, private, and had nothing to do with finance. He wasn't just a fraud. He was a fool. He was sleeping with the wife of the man who held his entire life in his hands. It was a level of self-destructive arrogance that was almost poetic. The final piece came from Odysseus. His report was stark, a simple timeline accompanied by a folder of high-resolution photos. The photos were devastatingly clear, taken from a distance with a powerful lens. Julian, not with Emily, but with Anya, laughing in a secluded cafe, kissing in the back of a taxi, entering the Mandarin Oriental, their hands intertwined. But Odysseus had provided something more, a pattern of life. Julian was a creature of habit. He was also careless. He used the same personal credit card, the one I now knew was perpetually maxed out, for his trysts with Anya and for dinners with my daughter. He thought he was invisible. He thought no one was watching. I sat at my oak table in the silence of the basement, the 3 reports laid out before me. The financial analysis, the character study, the raw surveillance. It was a complete picture. The cardboard facade of Julian Vance had been stripped away, and what lay beneath was pathetic, a terrified, insecure con man in a mountain of debt, juggling a pyramid scheme, a dangerous affair, and a new marriage he saw as his last, best hope for a bailout. His marriage to Emily wasn't a romance. It was a leveraged buyout. He had targeted her, charmed her, and isolated her, all with the goal of getting his hands on the money he believed her rich, quiet father possessed. He'd rushed the wedding and cut me out because he was running out of time. He needed to secure the asset. He needed my gift for the penthouse, not for a place to live, but as a desperate infusion of cash to placate his real investors. My initial anger had burned away, leaving behind something far colder and more dangerous, pity, not for him, but for the damage he was about to cause my daughter. The man she loved didn't exist. He was a ghost, a fiction, and when his world inevitably collapsed, it would collapse on top of her. I couldn't let that happen. A direct confrontation was out of the question. Showing Emily the files, the photos, the proof, it would be my word against her husband's. He would twist it, call me a jealous, controlling father. He would paint me as the villain, and in her current state, she might even believe him. No, she couldn't be told the truth. She had to discover it for herself. I couldn't just destroy him. I had to orchestrate a scenario so perfect, so undeniable, that Emily would see the real Julian with her own 2 eyes. I had to build a stage, write a script, and cast all the players. Julian would be the star of the show, and he wouldn't even know he was performing until the final act. I looked at the picture of Julian kissing Anya, at the financial statements, bleeding red ink, at the notes detailing his sad, desperate life. The plan began to form in my mind, not a plan of simple revenge, but of rescue. It would be intricate, risky, and it would require me to use skills I had long hoped to leave buried. He thought my world was small and quiet. He was about to find out that my library had a very, very deep basement. The most effective trap is the one the prey walks into willingly, believing it leads to a prize. My prize for Emily had to be something she genuinely desired, something that would seem like a stroke of incredible luck, a validation of her talent and passion. Emily's world was art. She lived and breathed it. For months, she had been talking about the annual Emerging Visions auction, a highly exclusive event in New York hosted by a prestigious gallery. It was a kingmaker event for up-and-coming artists and a networking paradise for curators. Getting an invitation was nearly impossible for someone at her level. It was time to pull a book from a very dusty shelf. Years ago, I had done a small, discreet job for the chairman of the board of that very gallery. It involved a messy divorce and a Goya painting that the wife was trying to hide from the settlement. I found the painting. He never forgot. We hadn't spoken in a decade, but a debt like that doesn't expire. A single phone call was all it took. I didn't ask for a favor for myself. I spoke about my talented daughter, the promising young curator. I spoke of her passion for a particular sculptor whose work, I knew, was headlining the auction. "Arthur, it's done," he said, his voice oozing the smooth satisfaction of a man granting a boon. "Not just an invitation. She'll be an honored guest. We'll say she's the recipient of our new patron's grant for curatorial excellence. It comes with a travel stipend, a suite at the plaza, and a seat at my table. She'll be the talk of the evening." It was more than I could have hoped for. It was perfect. A prestigious grant, an all-expenses-paid trip to New York, a stay at the plaza. It was an offer so spectacular, so validating, that Emily would never question its legitimacy. And more importantly, it was an offer that Julian, with his desperate craving for status and his need to be seen in the right places, could not possibly resist. He would see it as his own triumph, a chance to network with the real money he so desperately needed. The official email arrived in Emily's inbox 2 days later. She called me, screaming with joy, her voice cracking with emotion. "Dad, you're not going to believe this. The Beaumont Gallery. They gave me a grant. I'm going to New York. They're putting us up at the plaza." "Sweetheart, that's incredible," I said, letting the warmth and pride fill my voice. "I'm so proud of you. Your mother would be over the moon." This part, at least, was true. "Julian is so excited," she gushed. "He's already clearing his schedule. He says this is the big break we've been waiting for, a chance to meet the right people." Of course he was. The cheese was on the spring, and the mouse was already salivating. Now, for the second part of the trap. The part not for Emily, but for Julian. I needed to get Anya, his lover, and her husband, the Brighton Beach investor, to New York. At the same hotel. At the same time. This required a more delicate touch. I couldn't use my own network. The links could be traced. I had to create a catalyst from within their own world. Through Isabella's file, I knew the husband, a man named Sergei, was pathologically jealous and possessive. A classic flaw and an easy one to exploit. I used a burner phone and a voice modulator, a piece of tech from my old toolkit. I made an anonymous call to Sergei's right-hand man, a brutish enforcer whose loyalty was to the money, not the man. Posing as a disgruntled employee from the Mandarin Oriental's billing department, I spun a simple story. I was calling to flag a potential security issue. A guest, Mr. Julian Vance, had been making regular cash payments for a day-rate room, always on Wednesdays. But recently, he had accidentally left behind a credit card receipt. The name on the card? Anya Fordkov, Sergei's wife. "I'm sure it's nothing," I said in a nervous, bureaucratic voice. "But our policy is to report any irregularities involving high-profile guests. We just thought Mr. Volkov would want to be aware." I didn't need to say more. I had planted the seed of suspicion in the most fertile ground imaginable. Sergei wasn't the kind of man who hired lawyers. He hired people to break legs. He would investigate, and he would be furious. But I couldn't leave his reaction a chance. I needed to control the timing and the location of the explosion. A day later, another anonymous message, this time a simple text to Sergei's enforcer from a different burner phone. "Heard Vance is taking your boss's wife to NYC this weekend. The Plaza, Suite 1108. He's celebrating a big score." Laughing about it. It was a lie, but it was a believable one. It combined a kernel of truth, the trip to the Plaza, with the two things guaranteed to enrage a man like Sergei: infidelity and being made a fool of. The suite number was, of course, the one the gallery had reserved for Emily and Julian. The final piece of the puzzle involved Julian's other problem, his debt. He was on the verge of defaulting on a bridge loan from a different, less patient creditor, a small, vicious outfit from South Boston. I had Marcus, my SEC archivist, anonymously forward them Julian's real financial statements, along with his flight itinerary to New York. The message was clear: your boy is out of money, and he's skipping town for a luxury weekend. The stage was now set. In New York, my daughter would be anticipating the night of her professional life. Her husband, Julian, would be preening, ready to perform, completely unaware that he was walking into a perfect storm. His primary investor and cuckolded husband would be heading there, incandescent with rage. His other creditors would be closing in, convinced he was trying to flee, and his mistress would be right there in the middle of it all. It was a complex, multi-layered trap, designed not just to catch him, but to have him tear his own life apart in front of the one person he had fooled the most. I felt a cold knot in my stomach. I was using my daughter as bait. It was a terrible, necessary act. I was leading her into a moment of profound pain and heartbreak, but it was the only way to lead her out a life of lies. I had to show her the monster, so she would finally stop loving the mask. This wasn't just about justice for me anymore. It was about surgery for her. It was going to hurt, but it was the only way to save her life.